Okay, so let's take a look at this problem. Perry, this is 2.5.19, and Perry is going for a 2-hour trip through towns and on country roads. She averages 25 miles per hour on country roads, 25 miles per hour through towns. And if she travels 3 times as far on country roads as she does through towns, what is the total length of her trip? So we're going to let D equal to the distance traveled in towns. And according to the problem, and I'm looking at this part of the problem, she travels 3 times as far on country roads as she does through towns. So if D is the distance that she traveled in towns, then she traveled 3 times that distance on country roads. All right, now what we know in total is the time. We know that it was a 2-hour trip. So we know total time is 2 hours. And we have this relationship that we need to know, that distance equals rate times time. And if we want to solve that for time, since it's time we know in total, it's time we want to solve for. So we divide both sides of this equation by rate, and we get that distance over rate is equal to time. We know our total time is 2 hours. We know that the distance traveled in towns is D, and the rate traveled in towns was 25 miles per hour. So distance divided by rate in the towns gives me the time, the portion of the 2 hours that was spent in towns. Now I'm going to add to that the distance traveled on country roads, 3D, divided by the rate traveled on the country roads, and that was 55 miles per hour. So this total time, 2, is the distance on the town, in the towns, divided by the rate in the towns, which actually gives me the time traveled in towns. So this is actually time traveled in towns. So D over 25 is the time traveled in towns. 3D over 55 is the time traveled on country roads. Because remember, distance divided by rate gives us time. So this is D is the distance traveled in towns. 25 miles per hour is the rate traveled in towns. 3D is the distance traveled on country roads. 55 is the rate traveled on country roads. So we have an equation, and if we solve it, we'll have the distance traveled in towns. So notice D is the distance traveled in towns. So when we solve this, that D is what we're going to find. We won't have the total time just by solving. We'll talk about how to get that after we find D. All right, so let's clear the fractions out of the problem. And it turns out that my LCD my LCD is actually 275. So I'm going to multiply every term of the problem by 275. And that's going to clear the fractions out of the problem. If you didn't have 275 as your LCD, the lowest common denominator, you could use just a common denominator. You could multiply 25 by 55 and you'll get a common denominator. That would be a number bigger than 275, but it would still work and it's easy to find. It would actually be 5 times as much as 275. But if you can find your least common denominator, that keeps your numbers as small as possible. So I get 550 when I multiply 275 by 2. Now 25 divides into 275 11 times, and 55 divides into 275 5 times. So I wind up with, and my whole point, I want to divide the denominators into the LCD because that's how I'm going to clear the denominators. So I wind up with 11D plus 15D. So 11 times D is what I'm left with here, and 5 times 3D is what I'm left with here. So 550 equals 26D. And when I divide both sides of this by 26, I get that, and I also need to reduce, so I can divide 550 by 2. So I divide 550 by 2, and I divide 26 by 2, and I get 275 over 13. So that's my distance traveled in the towns. The distance traveled on the country roads is 3D. So that'll be 3 times 275 over 13. So that'll be 825 over 13. And that was my distance traveled on country roads. And when I have to add the two distances together, total distance, which is the total length of the trip, comes when I add these two together. So I'm going to be adding 275 over 13 to 825 over 13 to get 1100 over 13. And if I divide 13 into 1100, if I divide 1100 by 13, I get 84. And 84 times 13 is 1092. So if I subtract that from 1100, I have 8, a remainder of 8, and I put that over 13 and add that to the 84. Actually, this means 84 plus 8 over 13, and as a shortcut, we don't write the plus sign, but this really is addition. So the length of the trip is 84 and 8/13 miles. So that's the total length of the trip. And notice we get that by adding the time that the distance that she traveled in the towns to the distance that she traveled on the country roads. All right, so that is really the end of the story, and that is that I take the distance traveled in towns, which was 275 over 13 miles, and add that to the distance traveled on country roads, which was 825 over 13 miles, and I get 1100 over 13 miles, which is 84 and 8/13 of a mile.